I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. During a global crisis like the one that we are witnessing right now, we become more aware of how vulnerable we are. We look at health and security infrastructure and wonder if we will be deprived of it because there is no longer any space for us in the system. It's a peculiar and frightening feeling, but it's also a chance to look deeper into the world we live in and talk about those who are systematically and continuously deprived of some of the most basic human rights. Amongst this group are the over 70 million refugees. On today's show, we talk about where in our global conversations of progress and security do we put the lives of these millions of refugees. Joining us for this conversation is Mr. Asif Munier, who's a development professional who has also worked with the United Nations agencies in Bangladesh. He joins us from Dhaka. Also joining us is Ms. Dace Kavasa, who's a lawyer and sustainability and diversity consultant. She joins us from Latvia. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Kavasa, when we're talking about the situation of refugees and when we talk about the various systems in place that isolate them, that ostracize them, that also put them out of the system in the first place. How do all of these processes come to make refugees more vulnerable than they already are?
I think, as you pointed out, it's people are already being enclosed and limited in certain rights, so freedom of movement, even the right to education, sometimes right to food, etc. So I think this situation, even if you're not in a closed space, but we experience at this moment in Europe when airports are being closed, no movement is happening. So every person is kind of starting to experience what it is to be closed off. And we see this super highly important nature of the government as this social network support, which is healthcare, which is also education, if we think, but then all the distance opportunities. And I think for what we've identified as well is the more close the group is or the situation, the space is, there is a certain groups, for example, violence against women, the domestic violence numbers are going to be increasing as well. So, and I think when you tenfold it with regard to refugees with the closed group, which is already there, I think these issues are going to be rising even more, particularly when I'm worried about the question of accessibility of all the preventive measures in healthcare because of the crowded spaces in the refugee camps, crowded spaces in the refugee centers, wherever you are at the moment. And I think if the health systems cannot cope with the population in general, and the health system is not including directly the refugees as such per default, because there is a separate support system, then how is that all happening? So, and I don't know how, for example, our government here is going to deal with it.
Right. Mr. Asif Munier, as we hear Ms. Kavasa talk about this, that there is this knowledge, there is this awareness of the fact that there is going to be a grave threat, a grave burden on health infrastructures around the world, and governments are scrambling to understand how they can help their own citizens, yet alone refugees. But let's move back a little and talk about health infrastructure that has existed for refugees previously, before what we're seeing right now unfold. Take us through some of the circumstances, take us through the state of affairs on that end.
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of, if you say South Asia, with the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, but also Afghan refugees in Pakistan and other places, some health facilities, health services are available. Some of the basic health services with, government services are overstretched, but with the involvement of international agencies, UNCs, there is some kind of a structure. But as we're discussing, if there is some kind of an additional burden, additional emergency, that has not been sort of factored in. It's more in terms of immediate emergency that has been dealt with to some extent sometimes. For instance, outbreak of certain diseases, so kind of immediate vaccines that's required, and then on a day-to-day basis, certain basic health services. but it's not adequate to address any kind of new additional emergency. Because to some extent, these facilities are also taking local resources, local human resources, local government resources. So there's no way that it can sort of use those when there is an additional requirement, because certain additional requirement is also will be for the local communities, not so that there will be a deprioritization for the refugees, as I can imagine,
right?
Which is unfortunate.
Of course, it's unfortunate because it really shows the problem in the entire system. Refugees come at the lowest end of the spectrum. They come at the lowest end of priorities for many countries all over the world. But Mr. Asif Munier, you talked about when there is disease outbreak, when there is a need for vaccinations, short-term need, an emergency created within the camps. There is some greater hustle and bustle on that end. Can we talk about the outbreak of diseases? Is it more prevalent in refugee camps? And why do you think, if it is, what conditions make a fertile ground for diseases and other health-related issues to become greater and increase?
Yeah. Like I was saying, that there have been certain, possibility of outbreak in certain refugee camps and refugee-like situations, and these have been addressed. So there is already some experience of, large-scale vaccination, providing information, arranging this vaccination. It's a major operation, of course, but there's already some experience of that. But what I'm saying is that in terms of any kind of new disease, new outbreak, where vaccines are not available or not available in adequate amount. So that is where the challenge is. I would say that in terms of the system, the management system, that is to some extent available, even for large populations. But the scarcity of the supplies, that's going to determine. And sometimes, if there's an outbreak, and especially in refugee-like situation where you cannot really isolate people too much, people live in very close proximity, and you cannot take them out into the local communities just directly without ensuring precaution. So isolating them and really providing certain health services, that would be really difficult to provide for, especially for new kind of outbreaks.
Right. Ms. Dace, Kavasa, you do a lot with the issue of sustainability. You look into this, you provide your expertise on it. Now, the entire idea of sustainable development, of course, surrounds the fact and is premised on the fact that you will leave no one behind. Looking at our current system, in the way refugees are taken in the way asylum requests are processed, do you feel like we can move towards a sustainable future in which refugees and those who are seeking asylum are taken within the development model?
I think the current models need to improve considerably, and of course it depends from country to country. But if we even kind of step away and look at how different governments deal with larger or smaller populations as such, I think these crisis situations demonstrate that the main focus that we should kind of turn around our thinking is that the social network, the support, whether it's the public health care, whether it's public schooling, whether it's making sure that the same services are accessible to any individual disregarding what their status is. Whether you have a refugee status or you have a citizen status or you are a temporary worker that has come in, that you as an individual are autonomous being that has access to that service, and that group belonging is not taken into account. And I think this thinking, we see it more in Scandinavian countries, to a certain degree in some other countries, but I think that needs to be really thought through, because in these situations, these crisis situations show the vulnerability of the system, where we need to change. Because I think, to me, one of the questions would be accessibility.
Right. That is an essential point that you're drawing here. Issue of accessibility. Mr. Asif Munier, when you look at South Asia and specifically Bangladesh in this regard, housing such a huge amount of Rohingya refugees, and we look at the question of accessibility to basic schooling, educational institutions, healthcare, what do you think is the main hindrance there, something that we can work around?
I think, such a large population in a very small area, that itself is difficult. But also the way the camps are structured, if you want to reach, for instance, emergency health service or, say, transport to people who are suffering for certain, ailments or needs emergency support, that accessibility for even transportation is difficult. Again, getting the supplies to that place. In terms of seasonal changes, for instance, in the rainy season, if there's a requirement, any kind of, whether it's a disease outbreak or, person getting injured or any kind of emergency, again, rainy season, very difficult, especially if you talk about Bangladesh in the Rohingya camps, very difficult to access. For emergency health workers. Getting around it, I think that's something that we have mentioned, but it's difficult to resolve, is the fact that how do you expand the area of the refugee camps? It is difficult. If there's less landmass, if there's less accommodation for the local population, perhaps one of the things would be looking at, especially for longer term crisis, housing that is not just spread over land, but higher sort of structures that can have at least 2 to 3 floors. That is being discussed in Bangladesh also for the Rohingya refugees. If semi-permanent structures, perhaps that could open up certain spaces, even for certain health facilities, to have temporary medical centers very interior into the camps. At the moment, that is not there, and it's kind of like a tip of the iceberg, or if you say time bomb, that if there's a special emergency,
right,
it'll be really difficult to get to people.
Right. Ms. Dace Kavasa, now with these very essential issues, having access to transportation to get to those places, those basic necessities, those basic infrastructural units, is an issue because you don't have access to transportation in the first place. Now, he mentioned, Mr. Munier mentioned vertical structures, trying to create buildings that are more sustainable, that can house more people. But I wonder, is the location also the issue? We hear about so many refugee camps on the peripheries of many cities away from the main centers. Do you think that design is done intentionally and on purpose?
Whether intentionally or on purpose, I won't be able to answer that. That's the question of specific governments choosing the specific locations. Probably yes, because it's us versus them question. And I think, one thing we can talk about once a camp or once a center is there, what's that whole physical and say administrative accessibility, not just physically getting to places because they are far away, but also being able even to know that you have certain access to services. But I think, to me, it would be also that these bigger crises make us, and they're happening all the time, wars, tsunamis, viruses, volcanoes, etc. So it's just a reminder. We have to change the thinking, because if you think of a person who is crossing a border as an autonomous individual, not necessarily as a whole group, then how does that person get into the society? And it ideally, if these people, if any person becomes just part of society, not in a camp, and I understand all the limitations and I'd say documentation issues, etc., and there will be camps at least until the system works the way it works now. But I think when we have to look forward. We have to look and think, how do we see a human being? How do we see that human being? And we see that this person coming, whether in transit,
right,
for a shorter time or longer, wants to move relatively permanently, is part of our society and is part of that, becomes part of that general system rather than making separate systems. There is a need for separate systems, especially initially, because otherwise people are going to be completely lost. However, I think the thinking needs to change because camps are camps. The word itself is negative.
Right. Mr. Munier, as Ms. Kavasa talks about, a very interesting point here, the us versus them dynamic. How do you feel like this has been shifting or changing? This dynamic has been evolving all across the globe. Now, this is a very specific narrative which is used for identity creation. Them is necessary in order to know who you yourselves are. Are the refugees playing that role of the other?
I think there's mixed experience around the world, especially for longer-term refugees, who seek asylum or are trying to integrate into the larger society, and kind of reducing the gap between us and them. There are certain openness, but as the other speaker was saying, that there needs to be shift in the thinking. I think currently the world is not very open arms about refugees and asylum seekers, especially if it's understood that access to resources and all sorts of services, there might be certain pressures. Issue of trust, which is kind of sometimes lacking, and especially for refugees who are there for a longer term. In some cases, in some localities, people do probably integrate and try to build a society together. There is a support system, but I think that is less so currently in the global, the economic and the political scenario, and there is the authorities do not always also help, and I would say that at least in some cases I've seen that even the local media, they're also not very supportive or helpful.
Right. Mr. Asif, Munier, just one last question to you. As you talk about the wider economic and social situations that surround us globally as well, how do you feel like funding has changed for those countries that need to support a majority of these refugees that come to them? We know that almost 80% of the refugees are housed within developing nations. How has support changed for these countries in recent years?
I think some support has come in, but again, I would say that sometimes in the form of emergency aid, but for, again, longer-term solutions, longer-term support, that sometimes trickles down and perhaps changes in terms of scenario change in certain countries, and not enough. And I would say that in terms of looking at, not just the support, financial support, financial aid, sometimes in the form of technical aid also, but looking at more the political issues of, like we were talking about, us and them, for the international communities or for the Western world, discussing with the developing nations how to address this issue of them and us. I mean, of course, there are certain internal issues, but I think the international community, I presume the international agencies, but also states, different developed countries who provide certain aid. It needs to go beyond aid support. There are needs to look at how certain things can be resolved politically also, and support networks. Yeah.
Right, that's an important point, and we're going to end on that point. Thank you so much, Mr. Asif Munier, for joining us from Dhaka, Ms. Dace Kavasa for joining us from Latvia. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we take a look at Syria's children and how they have lived through a 10-year war. Stay with us. Welcome back. According to UNICEF, some 4.8 million children were born into the state of conflict and chaos that has gripped Syria since the war began a decade ago. That's millions of children for whom blood, loss, and destruction has been their reality since birth. On today's show, we look at the impact of Syria's war on its most vulnerable, the children of Syria. Joining us for this discussion today, Robinson, co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies and convener of the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda and Media. He joins us from Berlin. Also joining us today is Rachel Sider, Policy and Advocacy Advisor at the Norwegian Refugee Council. She joins us from Amman. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Sider, I'd like to begin with you and with a question that has been gripping the media a lot recently. Does the world, in fact, care about Syria's children? Do we feel like there is any hope left to bring about the empathy that might have once stood there for the conflict that's ongoing in that location?
It's really hard to believe that this week we marked 9 years of conflict in Syria, and the children and the youth that we work with at the Norwegian Refugee Council very much feel that the world has failed them. We're appalled that world powers have allowed this conflict to spiral completely out of control, to allow violence to kill, to maim, to displace millions of children. And we're really at a loss for words at this point. The children that we work with try to maintain hope and optimism for the future. But as you said, the United Nations has indicated that 5 million children have been born into this conflict and have known nothing but war and displacement. And it's really hard for them to feel positive about the future with all that has been taking place in these past couple of years.
Right. And that's very hard to hear, that it's very difficult to bring in that positivity, that hope within very young children who should have a bright future, who should be looking forward to good things. But instead, they have to face the daily reality of destruction, of war, of losing their family members. Mr. Piers Robinson, while we talk about what's ongoing on the ground, much of the stuff we hear, much of the stuff that we report is often very convoluted just because of how complicated the war in Syria is and how difficult it is to gather data on what's exactly happening. But when we talk about the state of children, do we feel, or is there a general knowledge or general understanding of the fact that they have been specific targets of violence?
Well, I'm not sure in the idea that there have been specific targets of violence in the sense that they've been deliberately targeted by various belligerents in the conflict. But it's certainly, as in any conflict, as in any war, the people who tend to suffer the most are the weakest in society. It's the children, vulnerable people. And really, so in any situation where there's a breakdown in politics and war takes over, which is what we've seen in Syria and what we've seen in many, many countries for many years now, it is always the case that children will suffer terribly in the conflict and in the violence, even before sort of questions of deliberate targeting and so on. I mean, there's certainly been some incidences of some notorious incidents in Syria where children have been murdered on camera, for example. But I think that the broader issue here is one of war and one of the consequences of war. And I agree very much with your previous speaker that what we have in the case of Syria and what we have in the case of really most of the major conflicts that we've seen dominating the international system is a real failure to, certainly from my point of view in terms of Western media, to really properly communicate to Western publics the reality of these wars and the suffering that people go through as a consequence of these conflicts. This is, from Afghanistan through to Syria, these have become, for many people in the West, almost invisible wars, where people they certainly don't understand the politics of the conflicts, but they also don't really see what is happening to people on the ground and to the children who are suffering in these conflicts.
Mr. Robinson, you talk about the fact that in wars like these, when there are such grave circumstances, when there is so much violence, children and the vulnerable, of course, become consequences of that war. But when we talk about the more direct impact, UNICEF figures say that close to 5,000 children, some as young as 7, have been brought into armed groups, have been brought as the front individuals of the war. What more do we know about that situation specifically?
Well, I'm not privy to those facts which you referred to, but it doesn't surprise me in any way. I mean, if you look at the conflict in Syria and you look at some of the armed groups, and the way they're operating, it doesn't surprise me that there have been a significant number of children forced into actually fighting in the conflict. You see this in many other sort of long conflict situations. You see it in the DRC, of course, in Africa, where you have child soldiers and children being forced into combat roles. So it doesn't surprise me at all that has been occurring in the conflict in Syria. This is, as we all know now, this has been a very long-standing, brutal conflict. It's involved many external actors. And as we know now, unfortunately, we know that many Western governments have been involved in helping to arm some of these groups who, by our own definition, are extremist. And in that situation, it's not surprising that you're going to see a significant number of children being forced into armed combat roles. And it's just another layer to the suffering and misery that we see in this war and in many other wars.
Right. Ms. Rachel Sider, now, when we have these conversations about children, it is, of course, a very layered issue. And to bring there's no way to bring justice to the matter, no way to actually shed light on what's truly happening. But the least we can do is try to explore the different layers in which children are exploited and the way children suffer through trauma. Let's take a look at a video which will perhaps shed more light onto how the psychology of little children is being impacted by the war. Let's take a look at it.
في طيارة العي قذيفي قذيفي
احنا قصيدة بضحك
طلعت في بضحك معه قذيفي في بضحك.
Ms. Sider, that's terribly heartbreaking footage right there. What more do we know about the invisible sufferings, the sufferings that don't manifest themselves either in physically, manifest themselves physically, but these that are more layered, that go deeper?
Yep, so that video is a really stark reminder of the psychological toll that this war has taken on millions of children. Children have nightmares. They wake up and are fearful to go to school because schools have become a place of attack and fear. Many children have been displaced and have found themselves on the move, fleeing aerial bombardment, shelling, and ground fighting from one location to another. They've had to follow their parents into unknown locations, riddled with explosive remnants of war. So children are really coping with some really serious difficulties and trauma. And that video is also a reminder of the resilience and the severe determination that Syrians have to survive this war and to ultimately recover from the trauma. And it's parents like that one that have demonstrated a tremendous amount of strength and courage, and that are working to get their children access to necessary services, learning opportunities, psychosocial support, experts that can help children begin to recover from what is still very much a traumatic experience. And it's important to remember that the war is not over yet. You have 3 million civilians that are trapped in a war zone in northwest Syria. Half of those are children, and they continue to experience severe trauma on a daily basis.
Mr. Robinson, social support in this regard, what can happen on ground? Are there possibilities for international NGOs, organizations to work on the ground, for independent monitors to work on the ground and help the situation there? Brief us more on that. Now, of course, with the violent situation that's ongoing right now, has there been a time when there has been more activity from perhaps individual groups, individual organizations?
Well, look, for sure, there are possibilities for NGOs and other actors on the ground to attempt to alleviate the suffering. I think that those spaces have probably decreased over time in the conflict in Syria. But I think it's very important, and this is a message really for all humanitarian actors. It's very important that whilst you need to try to deal as best you can with the humanitarian consequences of a conflict, it's also absolutely critical to try to address the underlying roots of a conflict, the cause of a conflict. And because unless you actually try to tackle with the political dimensions of it, the people who are driving the war, the people who are fueling the war, then you can do the best you can to try to alleviate suffering through NGOs on the ground and humanitarian relief and so on. But you're not really going to sort of change the underlying problem, which is creating that suffering in the first place. And so really, I mean, I think in the case with Syria, and in the case with many of the wars that the West has been involved in, and the West has been involved in fueling, and speaking as somebody who's coming from the West, that really what needs to be done is we need to put much greater pressure on the governments of the West to stop their involvement.
How do we do that? How do we put greater civilian pressures? When we see this deadlock, especially in the case of Syria, in this conflict that's been ongoing for years, how can civilian pressure play a role here?
Well, Western public, for example, in Syria, as is well documented now and is not disputed, Syria was one of the major components of the conflict in Syria was the American CIA operation Timber Sycamore, which involved the arming of a large number of jihadist groups throughout Syria. And that really propelled the conflict into the kind of the length of conflict that we have now. Now, so the Western publics have been oblivious to a lot of Western actions in relation to this conflict, as they have been oblivious to many of Western involvement in, for example, Yemen, Afghanistan. There's a whole series of conflicts that Western publics, if they knew about, and if they knew about their government's involvement in supporting and fueling these conflicts, they would be outraged. And they would put pressure against their governments. And that's the kind of thing that ultimately I think needs to be done, certainly in the case of the West, is that these conflicts and our role in them needs to be brought to an end. We had a big anti-war movement in relation to the Vietnam conflict and the conflict in Southeast Asia in the 60s and 70s. And we need that kind of movement now. And this is the thing that publics in the West can do, as well as giving money to NGOs and aid agencies and so on. They can also be pressuring their governments. But that critically requires Western media to be much more accurate and honest with its audiences about the causes of the conflicts that we see. So with Syria, we regularly hear about the belligerent role of Russia and the Syrian government, but we hear very little about the belligerent role of France, UK, America, Gulf state allies, all of whom have been involved in fueling and fighting the war in Syria for fairly straightforward geopolitical objectives, is getting to grips with that bigger issue, which is what I think both Western publics need to do, and also media and politicians.
Right.
And when that
Mr. Robinson, stay with me. Ms. Rachel Sider, not to present an overly pessimistic view of civilian pressure and the fact that if we are giving civilians of these countries the benefit of the doubt, if they knew better, they would pressurize their governments more. But when we see what is happening, like the refugee crisis at the European borders, can we actually hope for that? Because it seems like in this regard, when communities can actually take in these people, when they can actually help them, they are demonized further.
I think what we've seen most recently on the border with Greece and Turkey has been that refugees have become a bargaining chip in what is a much wider political game. We have been calling on Europe and other powers to demonstrate their responsibility when it comes to offering asylum to Syrians who are fleeing the war and have not yet fulfilled those obligations, including turning people away, which is a violation of the Refugee Convention. But we're also looking to the UN Security Council, which over the course of the war has met for over 222 hours. And in that period, every hour that they have met and discussed Syria, over 27,000 Syrians have been displaced from their homes. The Security Council has passed over 25 resolutions, but they've still failed Syrians in the fact that they haven't been able to stop the violence, they haven't been able to hold warring powers to account, and they haven't created a path to peace. So not to present more pessimism from my side, but we really are looking to both the Security Council as well as neighboring states to continue to keep up the pressure and to encourage a return to the negotiating table through the UN-led peace process, as well as to continue preserving asylum space for Syrians who have been forced to flee abroad, both in regional refugee hosting countries like Lebanon and Jordan, as well as in Europe. So that's really where the responsibility lies and where we can begin to see pressure posed on warring parties to cease the violence altogether.
Ms. Sider, just a last quick question, because in witnessing what's been happening, especially at the Greece border, we're seeing how these refugee camps, the Moria refugee camp, is in abysmal conditions. We're hearing more and more reports about that. When you say that trying to convince European governments to keep up with their humanitarian obligations, do you see them budging at this point in time?
It's really difficult to say. We've been encouraging them to relocate asylum seekers, both those who have been stuck in Moria camp for a prolonged period of time now, as well as to accommodate some of the hundreds that we've seen convening in Greek islands just in the past couple of weeks alone. At the end of the day, these are decisions that lie with governments that are also battling a number of other domestic priorities at this stage. But it's really within their obligations under refugee law. And we're hoping that at the end of the day, states will adopt a responsibility sharing approach in which they all take some of this responsibility among each other.
Right. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this, but thank you so much, Ms. Rachel Sider, for joining us, Mr. Piers Robinson for joining us and taking out the time. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.